Good morning. I'm going to speak in English this time because I prepare everything in English and I'm going to read. Now, after the very good presentation of Madame Martil-Kircher and Madame Le Benemer, we go to a very different geographical area. We have seen one of the most important markets of the Baetica and Amphora in Central and North Europe. Now we go to one of the areas with the lowest density of Baetica and Amphora, or at least, or maybe it's better to say, one of the areas where a lower number of Baetica and Amphora have been documented. While organizing this conference last year in an informal meeting during a workshop held by the Austrian Institute and the Danish Institute in Athens, Dario, Enrique, and me, we realized that it would be important to open broad discussion and place for new presentations about Eastern Mediterranean, an area that wrote and already occupied 1/3 of the Mediterranean, even more if we include the Black Sea, and concentrate at least half of the population of the Roman Empire, with some of the most important and populated cities of antiquity, such as Alexandria, Antiochia, Ephesus, or from the 4th century AD Constantinople. Opposite to most parts in the West, and with the exception of some articles, we can affirm that there is a lack of any individual approach to this topic in any important settlement of this immense region. And for sure, any synthetical approach has not been done concerning the diffusion of Baetica and Amphora in this area. If we have a look to the published acts of the first ex-Baetica Amphora conference 20 years ago, then we see that for 65 contributions, just 3 are related to the Eastern Mediterranean. 2 written by Dario Bernal and 1 by Paul Reynolds. 2 of them concentrate directly in the Levant, particularly in 2 important settlements such as Beirut and Caesarea Maritima. The other was a general vision made by Dario Bernal based on the personal identification and published articles in that area. But if we... ¿Qué pasa? Ya, no se tiene que mover. Okay, it's the only one. one hour with this picture. Okay, if we analyze the situation today, it is even worse. 20 years later, I am the only one in this conference that is going to talk about Baetica and Amphora in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I have to say, I try to convince people like Paul and others to present new data about the research in Eastern Mediterranean. Maybe for the publication, no, Paul? Yeah. Okay. It is out of question that this situation clearly reflects the geographical diffusion and diameter of the Baetica and Amphora commodities. It would be senseless to deny that the most important import places for goods outside the Iberian Peninsula were in Italy, southern France, and the military borders in Central and North Europe. But if we don't develop any further research in the East, we will never know the real impact of the Baetican and other Hispanic commodities in the regions east of the Italian peninsula. And this will always produce a lack of knowledge in such important topics as trade routes, connectivity and economic dynamics in the ancient Mediterranean, social and economic groups involved in trade and consume of those commodities. In this presentation, I will try to make a general vision of the Baetican imports in some important places based on my own experience, but also from some publications of college. I will focus in 3 main areas: the Aegean, South Turkey, Cyprus and Levant, and Egypt. Information is not the same for the 3 areas, neither among main places of each of them. But a first impression, for example, is that the Baetican imports only exceptionally reached inland regions. We could argue that this situation is due to the absence of long navigable trade routes as those in Western Europe. But also in Egypt, the Nile seems to have not acted as a commercial aid for the Baetican commodities. Concerning the most important settlements of the Eastern Mediterranean, it must be underlined that we have a big lack of knowledge in 3 very important places: Alexandria, where just some preliminary or partial works have been developed, as usual for Alexandria based on epigraphy. Antioch, where we just have some old works about late antique and medieval pottery. And then Constantinople, the big unknown, where the situation is maybe slightly better than that in Antioch, but only for the 5th and 6th centuries AD. In this sense, the finds of Yenicapi could enlighten the diffusion of the Baetican amphora until the capital of the empire in the early phases of the Theodosian harbor. But unfortunately, the huge quantities of material from Yenicapi are still unpublished. Let's enter in the Aegean, one of the richest and most dense populated areas of the Roman world. Maritime trade formed an essential part of the economic life of this region. Concerning the arrival of Baetican commodities, two main areas can be individualized. First will be the Corinthian Gulf and Attica in the Western Aegean. We could add Argolit as a geographical prolongation. Second area will be the East, the central coast of Anatolia and the islands near Turkey. And a third area can be suggested in the southern Aegean, maybe mainly Crete, where we have some good case studies such as Knossos and, above all, Gortyna. A fourth area will be the northern Aegean and the Dardanelles. Unfortunately, at current date, we have no evidence of, we have not published evidence of Baetican amphora in this area. And places such as Thessaloniki and already mentioned Constantinople will be crucial for a better understanding of Baetican imports in late antiquity. Let's start with Western Anatolia, with Ephesus, the most important city in the region from the late 2nd century BC until the creation of Constantinople in the 4th AD. Placed in the mouth of the Caistros River in front of the island of Samos, Ephesus profited of a very strategic position with very good connections to the Anatolian hinterland and a well-protected harbor. Further, Ephesus was from the early beginning an important religious pole and at least from the Augustan times the capital of the province of Asia, one of the richest of the Roman world. Nevertheless, the sedimentation problems that Ephesus suffers, as well as many other cities in Asia Minor, lead to a progressive detachment of the city with the coastal line. This situation supposed the construction for the 1st century AD of a harbor basin, here you can see it, and a channel connecting the harbor basin with the sea, as well as the development of a system of small harbors, gates, and dams to assure the correct working of the harbor. The city and the imperial administrations paid special attention in the maintenance of the harbor in Ephesus, which clearly indicates the very important commercial role of the settlement. If we talk about Roman amphora in Ephesus, then it comes to our mind the name of Tamas Betsetsky. While working in Ephesus between 2002 and 2010, Tamas documented some Hispanic amphora from the Tetragonous Agora and some other minor contexts of Ephesus. Even if they were not so numerous, he was lucky and found a good number of epigraphical remains, more than we have found in the last years. As an example, he found some stamps Dressel 20 from different periods. You can see the Dressel 20. We have just found a single stamp, this possible LET, from Lacatria, found in Terrace House 2. In this important residence within the urban structure of Ephesus, we have recently worked at a relevant context of late Euro-Claudian times. In the habitational room, Unit 5, in room 12A, it is this small room here, an extensive pit was uncovered under a mosaic floor and several levering layers. The pit measures 1.3 plus 2.2, and it's between 40 and 57 centimeters deep, and partially carved into the bedrock. The context is closed. It was filled completely with loose soils and charred wood, and with a lot of pottery, animal bones, of different kind of animal bones, and amphora. Within this context has a kind of ritual significance. And we know in the same area and in other units around the Terrace House 2, there are other offerings and ritual activities related to renovation works and use of domestic spaces. Concerning the amphora, we could document only for this small place 35 minimal individuals. You have to keep in mind it is really a small context. Among them, the Hispanic amphora, in this case all of them from Bética, are present with 4 exemplars and are the most numbered imports from the West. This is, even if it is a small number, this is a relevant issue from the chronological point of view, since in early moments, at least until the mid-Augustan times, the most numbered Western imports in Ephesus were the Italian amphora. Here you can see 3 of these pieces, one handle of Trestle 20, a rim and handle of Pentrand 2A, and several times already published Trestle 12 with the Garon Scomber titulus. We will come later to this and other epigraphical remains. We have some other contests with Baetican imports within the Terrace House too. Most of them are from the late 1st to late 3rd century layers. They are connected to the different construction periods of most of the habitational units, but also with the destruction moments of the building, well dated in the 3rd quarter of the 3rd century AD, as is the case of this Beltran 68. Nevertheless, we count on some pieces that correspond to later periods, such as the K19 with Malaga fabric, found in context of the 5th to 7th century, and linked with the reuse of units 1 and 2 as big workshops for metal and stone transformation. Briefly, we should mention the presence of other Baetican imports in Ephesus focuses in 2 main periods: the late 1st to mid-3rd century AD, and the 5th and early 6th century AD. The absence of context properly dated in the 4th century in Ephesus supposed the lack of information of this important moment concerning the Baetican and other imports. Nevertheless, we have also some imports of the Augustan and early Julio-Claudian period, such as this Dressel 711 with a partially preserved titulus mentioning the merchant's name. We will analyze further. The situation is similar in a not yet well-studied context, the so-called Domitian's depot in the upper part of the city, where a big quantity of well-preserved amphora were found, among them some from Bética, with similar types and provenance as the already mentioned. You can see for early moments and for late antiquity. Similar examples came from the so-called harbor necropolis, an important contest for late antiquity. Among the Baetican types, there exists a predominance, once again, of K19 and Dressel 23D from the Malaga region, even if we have also some Almagro 51C from Bética and K16 from the Cádiz area. An origin in Malaga can be also proposed for a special amphora we found in the harbor necropolis. I would say a big surprise. In this case, a copy of African amphora, K25. We know the production of these copies in many areas of South Spain, but the exportation is not so clear. As yesterday Alejandro spoke about the production of Cartagena area, we have also some of them in Ephesus. Then it's seen that this small production of copies or imitations also were sent to larger distances, for example, the Eastern Mediterranean. Even if Ephesus was during antiquity and early Byzantine period the most important settlement in Asia, and it must be underlined once again his important role as redistribution centers for imports coming from through maritime routes, it will be convenient to have a look at the situation in other important urban centers of the region, a region famous for the high density of cities. Flavius Josephus calls Asia Minor the land of 500 cities, and Aelius Aristides describes Asian urbanity as follows: one could ride through several cities on the same day and feel as if passing through only one. Places such as Miletus, Priene, Halicarnassus, or Smyrna are unfortunately still very poor studied in regard of their economic and commercial life during the Roman and Byzantine periods. The situation in Pergamon and his harbor Elaia is somehow a little bit better, but most information came from the Hellenistic era, when the city achieved the most important position in the Eastern Aegean. 2015, I was invited by the German Archaeological Institute to spend some days in Pergamon and to have a first look on the Roman and Byzantine amphora they have found in the Acropolis excavations since the 70s. Formed by a very heterogeneous material, the amphora spectrum also includes some finds from the Iberian Peninsula, but his number was very, very scarce. Among this material, some interesting things, as the presence of this amphora, that I would say is a Baetican copy of Gaulois 4, or better to say Dressel 30. Let me know what you think about this amphora. Further, even if other Baetican amphora, as some Dressel 711, were documented during my stay, an important piece came from the depot of the Antikensammlung in Berlin, where we found a Dressel 23 that was brought to Berlin from Pergamon, from excavation of the 20s in Pergamon. It will be very useful to search for material in the lower part of Pergamon, not in the Acropolis, and also in the harbor, where big quantities of amphora of the Hellenistic and early Roman periods have been found, but unfortunately not yet published. Waiting for new data in Asia Minor, I think we must remain in the vision provided by Ephesus, even if for sure Ephesus was a very special and commercial active settlement. The vision provided by Ephesus indicates that the Baetican commodities fluently arrived at least from the late 1st century BC to the early 6th century AD, having a special relevance in diverse periods, as for example, the late 1st century AD and the 2nd century AD. However, in recent years, new discoveries have been done in the Eastern Aegean, in this case coming from underwater exploration in the archipelago Fournoi, between Icaria, Patmos, and Samos, facing the Asia Minor coast in the Meander Delta some 50 kilometers south of Ephesus. An international team directed by George Kousouflakis have found very interesting material from a broad period. Concerning the Baetican amphora, an almost complete Halten 70, looks like a classical Augustan Tiberian Halten 70, has been found isolated in an anchorite. This kind of amphora is rare in most of the Aegean assemblies, and in Ephesus just a couple of pieces have been found. Other possible Baetican amphora is this Almagro 51C, that has been found in a rig loaded with Africana 2 and 3, but we have not yet seen the fabric, and for sure it could eventually belong to a Lusitanian and production. More information came from what looks like to have been a small cargo formed at least partially of a minimum of 25 individuals of Beltran 2A, or maybe better Puerto Real 2. They have been found scattered around a cape of an isolated island. Going west, a very important geographical point for the understanding of commerce and pottery in the Aegean is Corinth. If we are talking about Corinth and commerce, then we must also talk about two harbors linked with the city. It is Legion in the Gulf of Corinth and Kengerai in the Saronic Gulf. But also other points in the area, such as Ismi, will be important to analyze. In ancient Corinth, we have one of the oldest or earliest contexts with the presence of Baetican imports documented at current date. It is the so-called Punic Amphora building, dated in the mid-5th century BC. This context was already partially studied in the late 70s, and the presence of Punic amphora of the Western Mediterranean, probably Morocco or South Spain, was already suggested. Fortunately for everybody, since already 3 years, our colleague Antonio Sanz is working in the correct characterization of this material with the support of the archaeometrical research of Leandro Fantucci. They have found a huge number of amphora of different South Spanish provenance. We are waiting for the fantastic results of this research that will reveal the relevance of the imports from the South Spanish territories in the Aegean in a moment when they also start to be mentioned in the classical written sources. If you want to know more about this fantastic contest, you have to ask Antonio, that is not in the hall, but will be here later. In Corinth, we count on some publications of Catherine Theslane's, where some Baetican amphora appeared. 1987, she proposed a development for the amphora imports in Corinth for the late Republican and early imperial period, I have to say, even if she didn't have a huge amount of material, seems to be more or less close to reality, at least if we compare with the view transmitted by the Ephesian material. The Baetican import seems to arrive above all from the Augustan times and during the first 2 centuries AD. I will indicate that they probably continued to arrive in the late 2nd and 3rd century AD. At least we have 10 in Ephesus and other Aegean settlements. In a visit to Corinth, I could personally attest the presence of more Baetican amphora, such as Malaga K19 or some Puerto Real too, and also this amphora are we in front of address 8 from South Spain, or it is a Amphorae Emiliana di Morfologia Bética? I don't know what you think, Manuela. Maybe later we can discuss. The fabric doesn't like Baetican, at least the production place I know. It is a fine calcareous fabric with small quartz inclusions, but neither the morphological features of the fabric is really close to the Baetican amphora. We must keep in mind the close connections of Corinth with the Adriatic, since at least the archaic period, that find continuity until modern times. On the other hand, olive oil amphora should have arrived at Corinth as well, at least sporadically, as the stamp of the group Asiatici and one of the Friglina Scalensis revealed. They were published by Lidwin Will in 1983. We have also documented Roman Baetica amphora in places such as Argos, but now it's time to focus in Athens. If we are talking about Athens, then we must absolutely mention the finds of the Athenian Agora. Almost anything has been published of Baetica material of these important places that counts on several monographic publications about pottery and the work of many specialists. In this sense, it is astonishing that in the publication of Henry Robinson in 1959, not a single Baetica sherd has been presented. However, once you can enter in the Agora deposits, you directly realize that the Baetican amphora also arrived at Athens. Probably the most spectacular Baetican imports is this bunch of Puerto Real II, quite homogeneous from a typological point of view, and with some small variants in fabric for a macroscopical vision. Some of them, as you can see here in the left, have very big ink inscriptions in Greek alphabet and red ink. Together with this Puerto Real II, there are other Baetican forms of the early period, such as the Dressel 711 and Ventral II. Further, not only Pecios amphora arrived from Bética at Athens, the presence of Dressel 20 stamps has also been attested. Lidwin Will, once again, mentioned the presence of 4 stamps on Dressel 20 in Athens, 3 of them in the Athenian Agora. The person in charge of the epigraphical remains of the Athenian Agora excavations has gently indicated us that a big number of epigraphy in Western Mediterranean amphora exist, above all, for sure, in Adriatic forms such as Lambolia II, but also in Baetican Dressel 20. Going south in the Aegean, we arrive at Crete, a very important place in the routes north-south and east-west. There are some interesting points for the amphora imports studied in the island. Among them, the settlements of Knossos on Gortina, the Roman capital, deserve some attention. In Knossos, John Hayes published the pottery of the Roman and Hellenistic period in the British School in 1983. Among the amphora, in context of the 1st and 2nd century AD, some Hispanic material was found, like the Dressel 12 and Dressel 14 and a possible Beltran II that you can see in this picture. We have no idea about the fabric of this amphora. In case of the Dressel 14, from a morphological point of view, it looks like Baetican, but we haven't seen the fabric for sure. In case of Gortina, the Italian excavations of the Praetorian area brought in light a huge amount of pottery, especially big quantities of amphora of imperial times and late antiquity. Among them, the presence of some Baetican, and could be Lusitanian Dressel 40, for the 1st and 2nd century AD, should be again underlined. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the situation is similar to other places in the Aegean. Lusitanian and Baetican products seems to have arrived frequently until Gortina, but here we have a couple of problems. The first has been commonly indicated by several colleagues, the misunderstanding of both production, Lusitanian and Baetican. Everything of the 1st and 2nd century they classify as Baetican, but from the 3rd century everything was Lusitanian. The second problem is more accurate, the misunderstanding of several Baetican and in a lesser way Lusitanian products, and their classification as North African productions, above all included in the group of the Dressel 30. This is a problem we find in Beltran 68, but also in Almagro 51C and other types. Let's change of geographical area and have a look to South Turkey, Cyprus, and the Levant. It is an area where the Baetican products arrive constantly, but this seems to have been present in lower quantities than in the Aegean basin. Lycia, Pamphylia, and Cilicia were very rich productive areas, and the local amphora production is known at least since classical times. Nevertheless, the Baetican amphora, preferably the fish containers, arrived together with the Lusitanian products all along the Roman and early Byzantine periods. In Limyra, is in Lycia, we find a group of Baetican amphora of the 1st and 2nd century AD, one of them being a Titulus Pictus, that we will analyze as soon as possible, since Limyra is an Austrian excavation. In Eleusia Sebastia, both the Italian and the Turkish scholars have found some interesting Baetican materials, in some cases together with Lusitanian amphora, as this Dressel 14. As in case of Limyra, no olive oil amphora have been found at current date. If we go to Cyprus, in this case to the southern settlements of Paphos, Nea Paphos, and Amauthus, we find the olive oil amphora together with the same fish containers as in South Turkey. Not only in the Roman period, but they continued to arrive in late antiquity as well. In a more or less recent work of the material of the Polis excavation in Nea Paphos and Amauthus, some quantitative data were presented for context of the early Roman period. Even if further work must be done, they pointed out the relevance of the Hispanic amphora that, after the quantification system used by them, are among the most common types of the Western Mediterranean and reached levels between 6% in Nea Paphos and 11% in Amauthus. We can pose some questions related to the apparently disparity of the diffusion of Baetican olive oil containers. Is the arrival to southern Cyprus suggesting the inclusion of this area in different trade routes as the southern coast of Turkey? Could it have to do with the closer connections this area had with Egypt? Was any kind of redistribution of Baetican olive oil from Egypt? We will try to make later a small approach to this interesting topic, but at current date we must admit that this is a preliminary impression and further work must be done in both regions, analyzing bigger quantities of material and, if possible, for a wider range of settlements. Going eastward, we find some interesting places where the Baetican amphora have also been attested, in both the Lebanese area and the current territories under Israeli control. Some of these places were already presented in the first ex-Baetica conference by Paul Reynolds. In case of Beirut, where Baetican and Lusitanian amphora arrived from the Augustan and early Euro-Claudian period, including Halter 70 and several Fischel's amphora, but they continue also to arrive in the 3rd and 4th century. Even if Beirut was a relevant commercial settlement, in absence of a coherent data for Antiochia, is Caesarea Maritima, the capital of the province Judea and the biggest port in the region, the most important commercial settlement in this area. As in case of Ephesus, the availability of an important harbor and the good connections to an economic significant hinterland and terrestrial trade routes made Caesarea a very important commercial center, as the amphora evidence clearly reflects. 20 years ago, in the first conference of Baetica amphora, Dario Bernal pointed out that the Hispanic products already arrived during the early Roman period, but it was in late antiquity when they achieved a certain relevance. The products that arrived from Bética until Caesarea were both fish sauces and olive oil amphora, and some wine amphora are also tested. 10 years after the first ex-Baetica amphora conference, a new monograph concerning the finds of Caesarea was published. A big part of it was dedicated to the pottery finds, among them a big group of amphora. In these publications, where the pottery has been worked by Barbara Johnson and presented with good drawings, we find an elevated number of Hispanic amphoras, and as usual, the Baetican containers are the most numerous. Yeah, you can see some of them. Checking the quantity and diversity of forms of the Baetica imports, we can realize that they fluently arrived at least since the mid-1st century AD, and they achieved their peak in the 3rd and 4th century AD. Caesarea was founded by, or refunded, by Herod the Great between 25 and 10 BC, but the late 1st century BC is very scarce, or at least in published material. From Caesarea departed internal routes to places such as Jerusalem, Jericho, and Masada. It is there where the Augustan, or better to say, Herodian phases, finds a higher presence. In Jericho, in the winter palace of the kings, we have very important contexts of the second half of the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Among them, some very well-dated amphora with ink inscription mentioning consular dates. One important piece is the Dressel 12, see here, with the ink inscription that is supposed to be found in a context of 3115 BC. And it clearly indicates the import of high-standing fish products from the Bética to Judea already in the second part of the 1st century BC. Further, an obvious question that comes in mind regarding these pieces is, who were the consumers? If for olive oil there will not be much difficulty in accepting its consumption by the Jewish communities placed in the area, for wine and fish products the situation is a little bit different. It is out of question that Jews, as most of the ethnic groups of ancient Mediterranean, ate fish, but they have some restrictions. For example, apparently, they would consume fish sauces and salsa menta made with fish bones and scales, because the Jewish Talmudic laws does not allow eating spineless animals. But as it may, a spectacular find came from the Rhodian Masoda. A neck and upper part of the body of what seems to be a Dressel 12 from South Spain ported an ink inscription. In atramentum, or black ink, it was writing Garum Basileus, the first word in Latin and the second in Greek. This amphora seemed to have been part of a bunch of different kinds of amphora, as some wine amphora with similar inscriptions. It seems that the Jewish community, at least the upper classes, knew very well the Baetican fish products and consumed them regularly. Let's go to Egypt, the last geographical area we are dealing with today, and also an important center for the Jewish community, at least the big commercial settlement of Alexandria. The first thing to say about Egypt is that, as usual, we have a big disparity of data concerning Alexandria and other places. This disparity finds its reason in the different development of amphora studies and research in Alexandria and the rest of Hellenistic and Roman Egypt. This is not an extraordinary fact, since Alexandria was one of the major commercial points of antiquity, completely open to the sea exchange. However, the amphora studies in Alexandria present a very important problem, very accurate for the Roman and Byzantine periods. Attention has just been paid to the amphora stamps, and above all, to those of the Hellenistic periods. I am not courteous if I say that concerning the Baetican, or at least, or in general, the Hispanic amphora, Egypt is the worst case study within the three big regions I have presented today. As already mentioned, we count on a preliminary article made by the Elizabeth Lidwin Will about the Baetican olive oil in the Eastern Mediterranean, where she paid special attention to the stamps on Dressel 20 found in the Alexandrine Benaki collection. We have also a PhD dissertation that is based on this article of Lidwin Will. The American scholar could document 80 stamped handles from the 1st to the 3rd century AD. If this image is of an important arrival of Baetican olive oil to Alexandria should have some objections because it is mainly due to the preliminary article and focused on the stamp from a collection made only with amphora stamps, we must not reject it completely, because the number 80 is somehow significant. In my opinion, and waiting for new contributions, it is quite probable that some kind of privileged relations between the Alexandrian port and the Baetican olive oil supply existed. Already David Mattingly, in his article of 1988, comparing the Baetican and the African Tripolitanian olive oil production, suggested the arrival of olive oil amphora to Alexandria as part of the return cargoes of the Annona. A similar position is held by André Chernier, the French scholar who unfortunately could not come to this conference, and Michel Bonifay proposed a similar system for the diffusion of African red slip. It is out of question that Alexandria, as well as the other main ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, received the Baetican commodities in the imperial period through Ostia and Puteoli, or through Carthage. In which level they were private enterprises or part of the state-regulated return cargoes is something difficult to discern. Complementary evidence could arrive from a very peculiar place in the Egyptian desert, the quarries at Mons Claudianus, under imperial control with a small military contingent in the vicinity. This place should have been supplied in a similar way as the military and imperial centers in any other region. If Alexandria participated, at least partially, of an olive oil Baetican state supply, these amphoras should have arrived until Mons Claudianus. The current evidence is really scarce, but among the small quantities of amphora found by the French and British scholars, some Baetican are present, and among them some Flavian, Trojan, Dressel 20. What about other amphorae in Alexandria? Did the city not receive fish sauce amphora from the Hispanic territories? So far as we know, I have only found some mentions about Dressel 711 in an article of Cansenol. But the number is really, really ridiculous. Other important places in the Nile Valley, as for example the commercial centers of Coptos, important place mainly for the Hellenistic period, and Berenice, have brought in light no Baetican amphora or just small, very, very small quantities. For Coptos, we count on a good preliminary work of Marc Lawal, and no Baetican amphora have been found, even if one fragment classified as Brindisian could eventually be of Dressel 12. For Berenice, we are still lacking of more accurate information, and we are sure we will find more imported amphora, and we will find some Baetican amphora. In my opinion, the lack of a higher quantity of Baetican amphora in Egypt, including the lack of known samples of fish sauce amphora in Alexandria, is somehow astonished, and it could probably be caused by two factors. First, the existence of an important local production of the same commodities, something that could eventually have some kind of influence in the arrival of fish sauces. And second, once again, the currently poor state of research concerning the Western Mediterranean imports. In this sense, the presence of Baetican amphora in the Arabic Gulf, and above all in India, make us think about the lack of small relevance of them within the Egyptian assemblies. It is out of question that the main route to arrive at places such as Arikamedu in India was the Red Sea and the Arabic Gulf, several times mentioned by Plinius and by the Expeditio Mario di Trei. After presenting the material I have been working on in the last years, or I have documented from other colleagues in this vast region, I would like to introduce a couple of reflections about the arrival of the Baetican commodities to this part of the ancient world. The first and most obvious is, what are they doing the Baetican commodities in areas with a very rich and old agricultural production based on the exportation of surpluses of their territories? Apart from Egypt, where the production of olive oil seems to have been limited in certain areas, the production of wine is well attested in all the big areas I have mentioned. Concerning the fish products, their exploitation is attested in most areas, with the special significance of the northern Aegean and the Nile Delta. Further, the Black Sea was a very important fish production area and is much closer of all the territories. Amphoras from the Black Sea, especially from the Sinop region, have been found in good quantities in most places, maybe with the exception of Egypt, where the Baetican fish amphoras seem to arrive in lower quantities. One important question refers to the trade routes that follow the Hispanic routes. I'm going to be further. Until they arrive to the east. According to the archaeological, epigraphical, and literary evidence, it makes sense for the early imperial period connect Hispanic imports in the east, or at least the biggest quantities of them, with the big commercial harbors of central Tyrrhenian Italy. It is Ostia and Puteoli. As we have already seen, this hypothesis was already suggested by André Cerniat and other scholars regarding the Egyptian commerce with the Western Mediterranean, based on the origin and the names of the merchants involved in this trade route. As we have previously seen, we have some indication for the 1st century AD, thanks to the inscription of some Baetican amphora from Ephesus, where merchants' names appear. Unquestionably, these names leads us to Campania, in case of the gens Ophelia, and to the Julio-Claudian Imperial family in case of the Dressel 12 font in the Terrace House 2. Further, the Tiberian Claudia freedmen are known in many other amphora of the similar period, this Tiberian Claudia Alexa. Above all, in the material from Pompeii, where they are quite present on Cretan amphora of a similar period or a little bit later as the case of the Dressel 12 of Ephesus. It seems correct to think that they were quite active in commerce between central Italy and the Aegean, and they were not limited to handle with products originally from these two areas, but included commodities of other territories, such as the Iberian Peninsula and North Morocco. But we have some other indirectly evidence of the special role played by Puteoli and Ostia as big exploratory ports, very active in the redistribution of merchandise in the West-East trade. In Ostia, we have a very great example that concerns marble, above all Oriental marble and finished or almost finished architectural features. It is the marble stock plates in the Fabric Valley Street. Further, we have a very nice fable that I would not refrain to tell you today. It is told by Claudius Aelianus in the late 2nd or early 3rd century AD. Aelianus informed us of a huge octopus that lived in Puteoli and during the night went frequently to feed himself to the warehouse of the Iberian merchants present in the city. These warehouses were full of big ceramic vessels repleted of fish products that were, night after night, broken and plundered by the octopus. I find very interesting this tale that centrally points out the presence of Iberian merchants involved in trade in central Italy, probably not only to supply the Italian population, but to re-expedite it to other consumer areas, as for example, the Eastern Mediterranean. There are many other issues to handle on, and they must be regarded as questions for the future. Some of them could be referred to the production areas in the Bética, but also to the chronological sequence of exports, the popularity of Baetican commodities in the area, etc. Let's talk about Baetican amphora in the Eastern Mediterranean in future events. I hope we should not wait 20 years and we have more information in the future. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.